Hi, and welcome to Digging Up Roots, Perception of a Harmonic Root Within Three-Note Chords. My name is Jeremy Poperad, and I'm a PhD student in music theory composition at Kent State University in the United States. Before I begin, I would like to thank two of my professors, Drs. Wendy Matthews and Josh Albrecht, for their advice in designing the study and analyzing the data. The idea for this study grew out of my experiences as a jazz guitarist. In practicing all sorts of complex chord voicings, I frequently found groups of notes that were either hard to pick out a root for, or, in some cases, could be heard with entirely different roots for the same notes, depending on their arrangement. My curiosity led me to dig into the existing research to see what had been already discovered. Surprisingly, for a topic that we all learned in our first semesters of music theory classes, dating all the way back to Rameau in 1722, there isn't a large amount of empirical research into chord roots. I'll summarize what's out there, but first, here are the main questions I was interested in answering with this study. 1. Are roots of chords a real, perceptible phenomenon? 2. If so, do the harmonic roots we perceive agree with the roots according to conventional music theory? And 3. How can we predict which note or notes in a chord might be heard most strongly as the root, especially in more ambiguous situations, such as clusters or polychords? So, a bit of spoilers. The data suggest that the answers to the first questions are mostly yes, and the third question needs further experimentation to fully answer. For a very brief lit review, Ritzma 1962 and 1963 investigated what is known as residue pitch or tonal residue. To anyone who's ever watched a video or listened to music on a smartphone, this is a phenomenon we're very familiar with. The idea is that when low frequencies are missing, which is very common on the tiny speakers our devices have, our brains are really good at filling in the gaps using the remaining frequencies. Because of our innate familiarity with the harmonic series, when only the upper portion of a series is presented, the lower missing portions are heard even though they're not actually there. Ernst Terhart, in numerous studies such as Terhart, Stuhl, and Siwan 1982a and b, developed virtual pitch theory, based on the idea of residue pitch. The brain generates a virtual root for a harmonic series based on what frequencies are available. By extending this idea to chords, a virtual root of a chord can be calculated by comparing all the possible positions in a harmonic series a particular note could take. However, this approach does yield some uncommon root candidates, such as an F root for a C minor triad. Parncut 1988 offered a revision of Terhart's algorithm by weighting the root candidates, although Thompson 1993, in an excellent overview of the literature on harmonic roots, was skeptical of the approach. Empirical studies are somewhat scarce. Roberts and Shaw 1984 had participants compare pairs of triads for their similarity or differences, finding that chord quality and inversion type influenced accuracy. And lastly, a pair of dissertations from Indiana University investigated the perceived roots of interval pairs. Smith 1967 explored melodic intervals, and Hurwitz 1970 looked at harmonic intervals. Both found root tendencies for various intervals that were in partial, though not total, agreement with Hindemith's orderings in The Craft of Musical Composition 1942. For this study, I had participants take an online listening survey. Due to IRB restrictions, the survey was open only to residents of the United States age 18 or older. I recruited participants through an email to the Kent State University School of Music student listserv, and also through social media snowball recruitment. I posted on Facebook and a few music-themed discussion forums online. The survey began with a short 13-question demographic survey asking basic information such as age, gender, primary instrument, and so on. Most of the questions were drawn from the Allin Musical Sophistication Index, which is a short survey that uses a weighted algorithm to calculate and measure musical experience. The OMSI score is roughly on a scale of 0 to about 1,000, but since age and years of experience weight heavily into the calculation and there technically isn't an upper limit to human age, there also technically isn't an upper limit to the OMSI scale. After a quick briefing on instructions for the survey, participants began the examples. Each example presented an audio recording of a triad played on a sampled grand piano. Participants could click on a 3-note icon to replay the example as many times as they wished. Below that were 3 separate icons of single notes, which when clicked would play back individually either the bottom, middle, or top note from the chord. Participants would select which note sounded to them the, quote, most fundamental, stable, resolved, final, concluded, strongest, important, etc., end quote, then rate their confidence in their choice on a 5-point Likert scale. Choosing the terminology to present the participants with was challenging. To a trained musician, root would be sufficient, but as I didn't know what range of sophistication my participants would have, I decided to list out a variety of synonyms to improve clarity. There was a total of 120 example triads presented to each participant randomly. The triads consisted of major, minor, augmented, and diminished in root position, first inversion, and second inversion, and all of those were also presented in both closed and open voicings. One exception to note, augmented triads, due to their intervallic symmetry, did not include inversions. The triads were kept within the range of G2 to F-sharp 3 for the lowest note, which would place the chords generally inside the bass clef, which is the most familiar range that accompanimental harmony is heard in real music. The sample size was n equals 30. The demographics were broadly distributed across age and primary instrument, but very lopsided for gender. The ages ranged from 21 to 71 with a mean of 37.5 and a standard deviation of 13.78. Guitar was the most popular instrument with 7 participants, followed by piano with 5, and the remaining participants represented strings, brass, woodwinds, percussion, and voice. Of the 30 participants, 25 were male and 5 were female. The OMSI scores, displayed on the graph in decimal, ranged from 48 to 995 with a mean of 698 and a standard deviation of 262. So generally, most instruments were well represented with chord instruments the most predominant. A wide range of ages were represented, and overall, the musical sophistication of the participants was very high. There were 2 non-musician participants, ages 37 and 38, with OMSI scores of 219 and 426, respectively. And now for the good stuff. The results are, well, pretty much what you'd expect, with a few interesting nuances. The chord quality, inversion, and to a lesser degree voicing all influence the accuracy of responses. First, let's look at the overall distributions of answers. For major triads, participants overwhelmingly picked the conventional root note in all presentations, between 76% and 87% of the time, with the third and fifth being chosen in somewhat of a tie for a distant second place. Root position closed voicings scored the highest, with open voicings dipping slightly. For first inversion, the root was chosen slightly less often, with a similar dip for open voicings, and second inversion saw the percentage drop a little further yet. For minor triads, the distribution is very similar to the one for major, but the percentages for the root being correctly chosen have decreased a little. The percentages now range from 65% to 84%, and again, with root position closed voice the highest scoring presentation for selecting the root correctly, decreasing for first and second inversions, and also decreasing for open voicings. The results for augmented triads are pretty interesting, but also not unexpected. Due to the symmetry of the augmented triad, there is a more even distribution of participant answers. The lowest note was chosen the most often, but with open voicings, the lead is considerably smaller, almost to the point of random guessing. This apparent bias towards the lowest note is somewhat evident in the other qualities too, and we'll take a look at that in a moment. Lastly, the results for the diminished triad are also interesting, but again, not entirely surprising. Keep in mind that this is a diminished triad and not a fully diminished seventh chord, so while there is some interval symmetry, it's not completely symmetrical like the augmented triad was. The root was selected 65% of the time for root position closed voiced, but interestingly, that dropped to only 44% for root position open voiced. In the open voicing, there is a tritone between the bottom voices and a major sixth between the top pair, which suggests a post hoc theory I'll get to at the end of this video. First inversion is really interesting in that the root and third were chosen nearly equally in closed voicings, 43% to 39%. This is not a surprise since the diminished triad is so frequently found in first inversion in actual practice. Similarly, in jazz, both notes are considered equivalent roots, although usually for seventh chords and not simple triads. For example, a C half diminished seventh chord could also be an E flat minor sixth chord, which is an E flat minor triad with an added major sixth. While not quite as equal in first inversion closed voiced, the third was still chosen between 31% and 34% of the time in the remaining voicings and inversions. On the topic of alternative roots, the first inversion minor triad, which in a very similar way could be thought of as a major sixth chord, for example A minor and C6, did not appear to be supported by the data. While this equivalence in jazz music is common, it is also almost always involving four-note chords and not triads, so perhaps a future study of seventh chords could shed light on this. Now let's look at some chi-squared analyses. Comparing which chord tone was chosen to the quality of the chord, we can see that there is a decreasing accuracy of selecting the root as we move from major triads on the left to diminished triads on the right. Now keep in mind that this does flatten out any differences in inversion and voicing as they're all lumped together by chord quality. The distributions here are significant at p less than 0.0001. Next, comparing the chosen chord tone to whether the voicing was closed or open, we can see that closed voicings were more consistent for selecting the root than open voicings. Again, this flattens out all chord qualities and inversions together, but it is also significant at p less than 0.0001. Comparing chosen chord tone to inversion type, Root position rated the highest for selecting the root, decreasing a little for first inversion, and decreasing again for second inversion, significant at p less than 0.0002. Since the previous graphs all flattened the differences in voicings and inversions, here are the same results, but this time separated by voicing and inversion. The top row are closed voicings in root, first, and second inversions, and the bottom row is the same for open voicings. Note that the augmented triad is included in the root position graphs only and is excluded from the first and second inversion graphs due to its inversion symmetry. All tests here are significant at p less than 0.0001. Lastly, here's a comparison not of which chord tone was selected, but which voice, bottom, middle, or top, was chosen, separated by chord quality. As was noted earlier with the augmented triad, there was a bias toward the lowest sounding voice, which can be clearly seen here. While there isn't as much of a bump in the figures for the bottom voices in the other three triad qualities, the bottom voice does outnumber the middle or top voices in all cases. The test here is significant at p less than 0.0022. Returning to the opening research questions, 1. Are roots of chords a real perceptible phenomenon? The data does suggest that the participants did consistently choose a specific note for each chord as the root. 2. If so, do the harmonic roots we perceive agree with the roots according to conventional music theory? Yes. The most commonly selected note by the participants was always the conventional root, although the augmented chords were highly uncertain, and for diminished chords in first inversion, the third was a competing candidate. Both of these situations agree with musical practice. The decreasing accuracy of selecting the root when comparing chord qualities and inversions, with major root position being the strongest, mirrored the results of Roberts and Shaw in 1984, and the accuracy of their participants in comparing pairs of triads for similarity. 3. How can we predict which note or notes in a chord might be heard most strongly as the root, especially in more ambiguous situations such as clusters or polychords? There's not enough data yet from this study to say anything conclusive. The results for the diminished triads, particularly the closed and open-voiced root position ones, were interesting due to the large difference in how many participants selected the root. The post hoc theory that I'm working with is that the intervals between each adjacent pair of notes suggests a direction towards one of the two notes as the root of that interval, with some intervals pointing more strongly than others. The sum of these directional intervals leads to one or more possible root candidates. Further studies will need to be done to expand on this idea, and I plan to repeat this experiment with 4-note seventh chords as well as non-tertian chords such as clusters or chordal voicings. Another future area of research would take into consideration chord progressions and how changes over time influence root perception. The best example of this in practice is the cadential 6/4 chord, where the fifth of the chord is commonly heard as an alternative root. One weakness of this study worth noting is that I did not ask participants if they had absolute pitch or perfect pitch. A participant with absolute pitch and good knowledge of music theory could throw the results. I plan on adding this question to future studies. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to any questions you might have in the discussion.